Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's performance will include literal cross-referencing, wild-eyed pointing, and America's mayor's grandpa as we get our hands soiled in the garden talking about gardener Jesus here on Created Things. Hello, and a blessed Eastertide. Welcome to Created Things, the only arts podcast that is farm to table of plenty. I'm host, artist and psychotherapist Jacob Flores Popchak. I forgot my own name and credential for a second there. With me, as always, is my good and excellent friend, Father Gabriel Toretta. How are you doing, Padre?
Well, you know, I still remember who I am, so I feel like I'm not going to judge. Yeah. I'm not going to put myself in comparison, you know, but I may be doing better than somebody else in the room.
Yeah, maybe a little bit better than someone else. I was thinking about this the other day, and I should have actually looped it into the intro, but I was driving and I was thinking about, you know, you are a Dominican priest. Your official like little title, what's that called? Like the little letters at the end of your name.
OP. It's called a postnominal.
Well, postnominal. So your postnominal is OP, Order of Preachers. Would you ever go by like Preacher Gabe or Preacher Gabriel? Would that be an appropriate moniker for
some
you?
Some people have tried that.
Do those people get punched in the face, or do they get rewarded handsomely?
They might be in the Hudson River. I can't confirm one way or the the you know, because
see, I like it. I like Preacher Gabe or Preacher
Gabriel.
I think that works for your vibe.
It might. The people I think who can get away with it are oftentimes when I'm like in various places in the States and I meet a person who clearly goes to like whose primary Christian experience is like Black American Christian experience. They like, it's awesome because they'll actually come up and talk to you when you're wearing a habit and looking kind of weird, where like white people will basically like, they'll like take pictures and like put them on Twitter about like what like some kind of a Nazi is like wandering around town, and like they won't make eye contact, and they won't talk to you, and they won't do this and that, and they won't do that most of the time. But like Black people will come right up to you and be like, "You a preacher?" I'd be like, "Yeah." They'd be like, "Great." You know, and like they're all about, they're very frequently, like this will happen pretty frequently, is that like people with strong like Black American church experience will like identify you like both by category as a preacher, and then also use that like as a vocative title, so like a term of address, you know, so like preacher, how you doing, kind of thing. And it's awesome. Yeah. I love it because I mean that's our deal, you know.
I think it works for you. I think it works for you, and you need to be flexible about it, because you at one point in the history of our friendship cajoled me into calling a mutual priest friend of ours Pappy instead of Father.
That's true, I did.
Because you knew it would drive him crazy.
That's true, I did, yeah.
And it stuck, and everyone called him Pappy.
That's amazing. That I
didn't realize. A large section of the group for a long time, and he learned to eventually just accept it.
Yeah, he must have hated that. Wow,
sort of a learned. I don't think he liked it, but it was a learned helplessness kind of a situation.
Love it. I'm glad I contributed to that. That's amazing.
Yeah, so you need to be able to accept when the tide of public opinion turns to calling you Preacher Gabriel.
Well, I can accept it. You know, who am I to say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of old times in the history of our friendship.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very excited for today's conversation, because generally speaking, the art motifs we talk about are ones that, and this is very generally speaking, but the different art motifs or art traditions or art forms that we talk about are ones that you and I both have some kind of relationship to, but come from very different places on. And I always kind of think that's why, if the podcast works and all, that's why it works, because we can always sort of trust that no matter what information we each respectively have on a thing, it will be complementary, because there won't be much crossover because we come from such different planes on it. But this is an art form that I have come to really love over the last several years, or like an art motif that I've come to really love. But it was exclusively introduced to me by you in the very early days of our friendship.
Yeah.
And it is a perfect art motif to talk about in this Easter season.
And that art motif is the Pez dispenser. Ladies and gentlemen, the Pez dispenser.
Yeah. Oh my God. I want to do an episode on Pez dispensers so
Look
bad,
what I did.
dude. That would be amazing. There's a new documentary about this guy who like made millions and got in a huge legal battle because he was like illegally importing Pez dispensers and like selling it somehow. And it got like, it's like a documentary called like the Pez. Oh God, someone's listening to this and screaming at their music player right now, being like, "This is the actual title." It's something like the Pez Mafia,
incredible,
or the Pez Cartel, or something. Yeah, we should do an episode. But no, to rewind. So I was new to Cincinnati. I had moved there for a job. I was looking for artsy friends. I was looking for Catholic friends, but not like weirdos. And I happened upon this group that you were leading. Did not know you at the time. Ended up being full of weirdos, including you, but you were the kind of weirdo that I liked. And you were leading group discussions on different trends in art history in a very accessible, quirky way. And you brought up a particular art motif, again, perfect for this Easter season. At time of posting, it is Easter. That I've been kind of obsessed with ever since then. And I was shocked that I had never encountered it before then. And it turns out most people have never encountered this, despite how when you start to look at it, it's actually kind of everywhere. So I've beaten around the proverbial bush enough on this. Talk to me about tell us what you were showing that evening that so struck me.
Sweet. Well, I'm gonna continue to circle around the bush just a little bit because
of course.
My own experience of this started like this, which is that in like 2007 or something, I took a absolutely classic graduate student backpack trip through Europe. I'd never been to Europe before, and spent like 9 days or something in Rome. And a Dominican friend of mine who had lived in Rome for a long time told me, I was asking him for advice about like things I should do and where I should go. And he said, "Oh, you absolutely have to go to this church run by the Dominicans in Rome called Santa Maria sopra Minerva." And he said, when you go in, as soon as you get through the door, immediately turn to the right. And there'll be a side chapel that's kind of hidden by the door when you open it. And there you will see something very rare and very exceptional. And that is a painting of Jesus with a hat. And that's all he said. He just said, it's a painting of Jesus with a hat. And I was like, I am down for this. So I traveled like, however long it is, like 4,000, 5,000 miles, to see a painting of Jesus wearing a hat. And sure enough,
you took a pilgrimage, as it were, as we so often discuss. You took a pilgrimage.
I took a pilgrimage to Jesus wearing a hat. And
did you get a little pewter pin of Jesus wearing a hat?
I got a pewter pin of something, but it was very strange. And they told me it was Jesus wearing a hat, but I'm going to tell you right now, that's not what it looked like to me.
To get what we're talking about, go listen to our private part pilgrim pins episode.
Huzzah!
In this same series.
So listen, instead,
cross reference.
Yes, that was amazing. Thank you. Instead, it was this.
Oh, it's literally a cross reference because Jesus on the cross.
Because we did it.
Oh my God, we're killing it today.
We're killing over here. Just don't even. Just
we should record episodes not at 11 o'clock at night more often. We're quicker. We're more rapid fire.
I feel like we actually, because when I'm sort of vaguely awake, we seem to have a better rapport. Weird how that works, But yeah. So okay. So I did this. So I traveled for like however many thousand miles. And I got to Rome, and I was like, yeah, I'm in Rome. And I went to the Minerva, and then like I went through the door, and took me a while to find the chapel because it is literally hidden by the door when you open it. But then I saw
such
this
weird placement. Why would they put art right behind the door?
That's a chapel. There's a lot of chapels in the space. Don't worry about it, So I saw this amazing painting of, in fact, Jesus wearing a hat. And at first, like all I noticed was like, oh, this is just Jesus wearing a hat. Because in fact, spoiler alert, he's wearing a hat. He's also wearing like this kind of like blue garment-y thing that's kind of covering his torso and and his legs, or at least down to the knees, and it's sort of swirling about him. So it's kind of garment-y more than clothy, and
generous to call it a toga.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of like wrapping a towel around you at the gym, but
like
with
diagonally
pizzazz.
though. Yeah, exactly. And then he's got a shovel
fabulous.
flipped around his back.
He's got a shovel.
He's got a shovel. So hold on. He's got a hat on. So step one, he is in fact wearing a very dandy green hat. Approximately as dandy as the hat that my co-host is currently wearing. But it's green and has a big floppy brim.
Oh, you finally referenced the elephant in the room.
I did, yeah.
Yes, I'm wearing a hat.
He's wearing a hat.
And you should check out the video dandy version of the podcast to see said hat.
Yeah, which is amazing because I have personally worn said hat, and for me, it's like it looks like a lampshade. Like it sticks so far out from my head that it looks like a lampshade, but it actually looks kind of small on your head, which suggests that we have different size heads. It's a mystery. Yeah. People are different, everybody. Okay, end scene. Great episode. Go and create cool things or however we end this episode. Anyway, great.
Whatever we say
at the end. Okay, so listen. So Jesus is wearing a hat. It's floppy. It's green. It's really delightful. It's got a front and back brim. It's what you need in your life. And then he's got a shovel. Which hold on, like not actually seen Jesus holding a shovel before. And then he's doing this kind of like contrapposto, like his legs are kind of crossed and he's standing, and he's got this hand out. And then down at his feet is obviously Mary Magdalene. So it's like a elegantly dressed kind of 17th century lady who's on her knees and is kind of supplicating. And it's Mary Magdalene. And then suddenly I realized, okay, I didn't travel however many thousand miles to see a picture of Jesus with a hat. I traveled however many thousands of miles to see what we in an art genre term is noli me tangere, which is the Latin of the Vulgate for the Latin version of the Bible used for a long time for that line in the gospel where the risen Christ appears to Mary and he says, "Don't hold on to me." So that's what it is. That's what it is. And before we go on to talk about this more, I actually just want to pause for a quick second and actually just read the gospel passage, because this is it's not super common that in art history, that an art motif or image type or whatever has a specific reference in the scriptures. It's often a kind of attitudinal or atmospheric connection, or it's a connection of a bunch of different things. This one, while as we talk, we'll see it pulls on a lot of threads, because this is basic Christian belief that all the threads in the Bible pass through Christ, and so they all pass together.
Yeah, it's a very Kaiser Soze, Pepe Sylvia kind of red thread wall.
Yeah. There's a lot of wild-eyed pointing. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the gospel passage. So it's from John 20, 13 to 17. They said to her, now that they are angels, and if I control myself and we control ourselves, I have some images with some sweet angels in them. But they, the angels, said to her, "Woman," this is Mary Magdalene, "why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." That being because she's come to the tomb and discovered it to be empty. Saying this,
right, so this is after the death of Christ,
right? So this is how she discovers that Christ has been risen from the dead. Saying this, she turned round and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom do you seek?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." So this "do not hold on to me," noli me tangere, because this is such an intimate and beautiful encounter between Mary Magdalene and the risen Christ, and because it's this dramatic encounter of the risen character of Christ, and it reveals all kinds of things about his resurrected body and the promise for our own resurrected bodies. This is hugely beloved in the Christian tradition, period, in all kinds of ways, and it has left a gigantic swath through Christian visual and art history.
Not unlike the swath what swirls around Jesus Christ so fancily in these images.
Yes, in point of fact, garmenty. That's the sound that garments make when they're being blown by the wind. But it turns out, and this was the thing that I'm forever grateful to this friar for his totally random and weirdo introduction to me, to go like make sure I like hung a right in the Minerva and checked out this chapel where Jesus was wearing a hat, is that there is a subgenre of this Noli Me Tangere motif, the encounter between Mary Magdalene and the risen Christ, that takes this line, supposing him to be the gardener, as the central visual motif, which is to say that Jesus Christ is depicted in this subgenre of images as a resurrected gardener.
Which I love, because growing up this is why it struck me when you showed me this image, however many years ago now, growing up in a religious household in America, the images that I was accustomed to seeing associated with Easter and associated with the resurrection, sort of tended to fall into two camps. What I assumed were kind of traditional images where Jesus is sort of like catapulting himself out of a hole and guards are baffled on either side. In our Fake Rocks episode, we talked about this tradition among some Vietnamese Catholics to create these very elaborate papier-mâché tombs. And oftentimes you will see like a 2D printed cutout of Jesus sort of like hero posing and launching himself out of the tomb like a football star, right? And like I was accustomed to kind of seeing those things. Maybe he'd have like a flag of triumph as he like shot out like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And that's what I was kind of used to seeing. And then there was like a more modern image of the resurrection that always felt cool, but also maybe a little bit like schmaltzy, a little bit cinematic, where like you'd see Jesus sort of from behind maybe, or from like a slightly obscured angle, like from within the tomb leaving. So I think there's an image of him like sort of running out of the tomb, or even like people are really familiar with sort of the Passion of the Christ, where you get that kind of denouement, the mask is still floating around the water at the end of the mass kind of moment, where Jesus is like in the tomb and he just suddenly gets up and you get like a close up of his little hand with a hole in it. And those are the kind of the two resurrection images I was used to seeing. And both of those images focus on, of course, the miracle of rising from the dead. And they sort of skim over the relational component of the profound intimacy that's had, where we don't see Jesus rising from the dead in Gospels because no one was privy to see it. We just see the after effects, the aftermath of his most closest companions encountering him, and these kind of spectacle-based depictions of the resurrection like totally skim over that, and in doing so kind of miss the subtleties of Mary Magdalene initially assuming he's the gardener, and I remember being very young and asking about that and being confused, like, why would she think he was the gardener? And there's another key line, you read it, right, where she turns to him and says, "Rabbi." So the implication is maybe she's facing the tomb and he's kind of behind her and she sees him out of the corner of her eye. And so she just assumes like the guy early in the morning in this garden must be the gardener and doesn't like fully look at him, or maybe she's blinded by tears. Like, so that's kind of how it was explained to me. But I love that there's a whole artistic motif where they go, no, she was looking right at him. It's just that she couldn't see his face because he was wearing the largest straw hat and was just holding a shovel. And it feels immediately silly and like fan fiction, but then as you delve into it, there's like a ton of theological meaning and a ton of meaning for like relationship and what it means to be an artist and what it means to be a man. And like, just as I learned more about this image that you showed me, I began to feel genuinely cheated that the images of the resurrection I'd seen had always fallen into those two camps that I just described.
Yeah, I think I totally get that. And it's funny because that desire to represent the unrepresentable part of it, which is like the actual resurrection. This is super old, you know. So, for instance, there's a pseudo gospel, you know, one of the so-called apocryphal gospels. I'm blanking right now on which one it is. It might be the Gospel of Philip, but I don't remember. That
The Gospel of Saint Lulu.
Exactly. Can't, because, you know, like a lot of the way that those things worked is that people are basically like filling in the gaps. They were like really jazzed about X, Y, or Z, but like they want to fill in the gaps, you know, of the gospel. And so there it kind of looks like what you would expect. So like you got these angels who were like with their heads or like their feet are on the earth and their heads are in the clouds. And then Jesus comes and he's the same. He's like a giant and he like knocks things. It's like, it's crazy. You know, you think like this is sort of like science fiction-y fantasy type thing, but it's this kind of like supernatural. You're trying to represent the unrepresentable. And so it can be like a little bit silly.
Yeah, they always feel a little ayahuasca fueled in good and bad.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, totally. Like, and there are some of those, like Christ sort of like just being out of the tomb and just deal with it paintings that I absolutely adore. But this is a whole different jam because it's really leaning into this. It's leaning into the weirdness. And this is, I mean, I think this is generally a scriptural thing and like a Christian thing, is that when you find a line in the scriptures, particularly in the gospels, that are so tightly written, you know, don't take that the wrong way. Like, Ma, I just heard Father Gabriel say that the rest of the scriptures are written like crap. I didn't say that. I just said that the gospels are written really tightly. That's all. When you find a line that seems weird, like it's actually much better to like lean into it and sort of like force yourself to kind of poke it and press on it until something comes out.
Which is, by the way, I think just the thesis posture of this entire podcast.
Yeah, that's
just
true.
When you find something that's weird,
just lean into it, man.
Lean into it and poke it.
Yeah, just poke it until something cool comes out. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And this is so cool because it says like this is weird. This is weird. She's one of, you know, 3 people who don't abandon Christ at the cross. She you know, comes alone early, you know, at dawn to like just pay homage to his body, and like she sees him and she thinks he's the gardener, and you're like, there's so many questions. And even the text itself, like you pointed out, Jacob, like even the text itself is there are things left that have to be left unsaid because there's at least 2. There's one too many turnings. There's either one too many or one too few turnings, because it says she turned round and saw Jesus standing, but didn't know it was Jesus. And then they have this little combo, and then Jesus says to her, Mary. She turned and said to him in Hebrew, Rabboni. So see, that's one too many turnings. Like she's already turned towards him. So there's either one too many, or we're missing a third one, which is that in the meantime she turns away, which is also interesting. That like,
or she's spinning.
She just hasn't stopped turning. This whole thing is actually happening on ice. It's an ice capade.
It's just like a real whirling dervish kind of a situation.
Do it.
Just
yes, exactly. So yeah, it turns out
we have so many like Foley sound effects of wind in this episode. Your garments and
exactly,
and just
people spinning around, ice capades. I want an ice capades theme song for this episode.
This is oh god, yeah. You want to help me pay for that? I'll find somebody.
No, I want it for free. No, please.
Enough.
I'm a religious. I want everything that I want, and I want it for free. That's how we do it. If you're not a religious, that's called being greedy. But if you're a religious, it's called having about poverty.
Yeah.
Just deal with it. Anyway, I think that's so hot. Bad. I want to show, and to people who are watching the video, and to talk about actually the very first image that I showed you, because I think it remains my very favorite of this kind. But I want to give you a chance to show an image first and to talk about an image first.
Oh, no, because don't do that.
Okay.
Because actually all the images that I have discovered are exclusively, like, this was the one that launched it.
Okay,
like the
cool.
one you showed me was the one that launched it and formed my fundamental perception of all this. So I actually think,
Okay,
for me, emotionally, it's important to start with yours.
Okay, great. So this.
Thank you, though. Thank you for your gentlemanliness for letting me go through the door first. But no, please, after you, good sir.
Okay, so this is great. So I loved this, and then I didn't really think anything more about it. And then in 2018, I went to a Cistercian monastery. It's actually the oldest continuously operating Cistercian monastery in the world. It's a place called Heiligenkreuz that's not too far outside of Vienna. I couldn't speak German at the time, so that was just like for yucks. Anyway, it's such a cool place. It was founded in like 1174 or something like that, and it's been continuously a Cistercian monastery ever since. It's really amazing. They have a beautiful, beautiful liturgy and a beautiful way of life, and I like the community a lot. And
this is a Cistercian monastery. So this is giant fish that identify as the gender
that they
were
visibly
assigned
have.
at
Yeah,
birth.
yeah, exactly right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So Cistercians.
Sturgeons. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah,
that's
okay,
exactly
cool.
right. It's really
the
only bad part about being there on retreat is that like it turns out the whole thing's underwater, which nobody had told me about beforehand. But since I can't swim, it kind of worked out. You just drown and it works out. It's great. Yeah.
See our episode on mermaids.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's all pretty great. That's
much
also,
Crofts referencing.
Yes, exactly. It's also the plot of Black Panther 2, which I'm not going to talk about. But anyway, so one of the things about if you're a medieval religious house in and around Vienna, and you're still around, it is inevitable. Like it is just 100% the case that at some point, probably in the 17th century, some point, either the emperor or somebody in the imperial family, just woke up in the morning and just bashed you over the head with a Baroque bat, and like you just all dazed and confused, and suddenly your like beautiful Romanesque church is just a gigantic Baroque pile. So that's going to happen. Just hold your breath. It's going to happen. It happens to all of us. Don't worry. So this happened to Heiligenkreuz, and so it got baroqued. But then of course, if you've been baroqued, you've also been Baroque code. So in the beginning of the 18th century, a Venetian carver named Giovanni Giuliani.
Giovanni
Giuliani. His great grandson became mayor of New York. It was great. So Giovanni Giuliani, who's from Venice, he's a sculptor, and then he also becomes a spiritual associate of the Cistercian monastery, which is so he's personally connected to it in a spiritual way, which is really cool. And he carves for them this astonishing series of what we call choir stalls. So a choir stall is when you're a part of a religious order, you pray through the day. The church has a set of you praying through the Psalms and meditating on the scriptures and stuff, and you pray that in common. You pray it together, and if you're an older community, you pray in a church together. And because you'd have a lot of people doing this, and this monastery is quite large, it's got about 100 people in it. There's you see these big rows of stalls, just where you sit and you have your books and you read and you pray and you stand and you sit and you sing and you do all this stuff. It's cool. And it's really like, it's the place where you spend the most amount of time. That's kind of not your room. And depending on the community, it might be actually the place where you spend, absolutely speaking, the most amount of time, because you just spend a lot of time praying. So they tend to be really highly ornate. But these are really, really, really splendid. The ones designed by Giuliani. And there's this one that was so
It's really hard to take serious.
Hey, it's not my fault. His name is Giuliani.
It just takes Giuliani takes me out every single time.
It just kills me. I know. It's incredible.
You're painting like a really beautiful scene, and I like start to get into it. I'm like, oh yeah, I can imagine being there. And then you say that, and I just got to pull out
straight to Giggle Land. So, and the church itself is huge and beautiful, and it is in fact Gothic. Because it's built only when this church is built, the Gothic is only about 40 years old. So just to be clear, this is an old church, at least parts of it. So it's big and it's dark and it's all of this. And so I remember just like looking one day, like, and they have, I forget, their prayers start at some insane hour, like 5 a.m. or something like this. So I'm there and it's dark and it's cold and I'm like praying and there's beauty, it's beautiful and everything. And then I look up and across the way on one of these, so above the way it is, above where the monk sits, is, so you're in this kind of captain's chair sort of thing that's in a bunch of in a solid row, all connected like a movie theater, all made of wood. And then above the monk is an image. So he of course can't see it, but he can see the one across from him, right? So you're reflecting on it that way. Yeah. And I look and I see at the end of one of the rows is this breathtaking image of exactly this, of Christ the gardener. And it's Jesus wearing the floppiest hat mankind has ever seen. It's like you went to the floppy hat store and said, "No,
this is like the
sir,
Bert Kreischer.
No, I need
the Bert Kreischer,
hat.
like 4-foot diameter floppy hat."
I'm sorry,
like,
I thought you said this was the floppy hat store, not the skullcap store. Okay, it's like, give me your floppiest hat. I mean, it's so floppy, it's ridiculous. And the brim is like tilted up so that you can see his in a way that completely defies gravity because it's so dang floppy, so that you can see his face. Also over his shoulder, he's got a shovel. Now this is a bas relief wooden carving. So which is so the sculpture, so the figures are kind of like 1/2 molded. That's to say that like their whole back halves are basically wood, flat with the surface, but then they're about the front, half of the body is sculpturally molded. So so the shovel is sort of a little bit bent because when you're doing bas relief stuff, there's some technical problems that are just literally unavoidable. But anyway, there it is. And he's got Mary Magdalene, who's in a similar pose to the thing that was there in Minerva. So she's on her knees, but there's a lot more emotion because it's the 18th century, so stuff is getting pretty emotional in art, And,
right.
And she's sort of like, bah, wow, it's amazing. And it's not campy. Like there's a very powerful shock, like or joyous surprise, like she is overcome with surprise and joy at the same time, so it's really a powerful image. And this is tree and it's all really cool. But what is particularly wild about this image is that, so remember our blowy windy garment,
our fully wind ASMR.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to be a wind for a minute. Okay, great. This is going to last. Yeah. This is going to last for 45 minutes as I just talk in a low voice and blow wind noises. This is going to be our most watched episode ever.
Are you so comforted right now, listener? Are you so comforted by these?
Do you feel something weird tingling up and down your spine?
Noise. Yeah. That's the tingling of the resurrected Christ.
Tingle, 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 tingle. But dude, so he's also got this flowy, windy, roby, garmeny thing, clothy thing, but it's obviously just a flowy, clothy thing. It's not even really draped on his body. He is like, his whole torso he's basically naked so far down that you can see the what's the term for it? The pelvic lump, where your the hips join the abdomen.
The V.
Yeah. So you sort of see the molding of, because he's this guy Giuliani is a really good carver, and so you see like it's really well molded. You see the differentiation between his hips and his belly and stuff. And the garment itself is really only covering his genitalia, basically. It loops up to cover one of his arms, kind of, but there's a lot that I love about this. One thing about that is that it dramatically highlights the side wound of Christ, which, because it's a carving and because of the way that the lighting works in the chapel, is this kind of like gaping wound. I mean, it's significant, it's prominent, it's kind of it's gaping, it's black,
talk about weird things you should poke until something cool comes out.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, if it worked for Catherine Sienna, it can work for anybody. So that's the image, and I think this is the thing that I showed you that kind of got everything started, because it's so captivating. Now, artistically speaking, it's extremely well done. Those of you who are looking at the image, who are looking at this online, I confess, if you speak German and know what you're looking for, you could find an image of it online. If neither of those things are true, then you're just going to have to watch this video in person to see what the image looks like, because otherwise it's hard to find. But unfortunately, it's a photograph I took with my phone, and the lighting is bad, so it's not the best quality image, but it's the best you could do, and it's better than anything I found on the internet. So, from a technical artistic perspective, this thing is really a treasure. But I belabor the sort of the exposure of Christ's body, not out of a kind of like, historical pruriency or artistic pruriency or whatever, or just like I want to dwell on this, but like, because
we do love historical and artistic pruriency.
Who doesn't? But because it's so central to the image, it's absolutely wild, because the whole motif, right? Like the whole motif is that she looks at Christ and thinks he's a gardener. And like, how do you know that somebody's a gardener? Well, I don't know about you. I would say roughly 100% of gardeners I've met wear clothes. Roughly, I'm not going to be.
Yeah, no, it's this beautiful.
Absolutely. But the point is that he has to be wearing
baffling juxtaposition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like he has to be wearing clothes because you know that he's the gardener. But because it's the resurrected body in a resurrected perfection, he is shown in nude perfection, and so they sort of like square this circle by having this very this windy blowy garmenty thing, that highlights the fact that this is a, so to speak, a visual artifact, which is to say that it's there like for the monastic viewer or whatever, not to kind of create too much visual confusion about what they're looking at or whatever. We could think about various things about that, but it's there specifically as a visual artifact. Like it's clear that within the like visual logic of the image itself, this garment is represented so as not to exist.
Right. Yeah. It's yeah. And it's also, I think, it's trying to connect two realities in the scriptures, because what do the disciples find when, after Mary Magdalene reports to them that she's seen the resurrected Christ, they run to the tomb and they find, the scripture tells us, the burial garment folded and placed in the tomb. So the implication being that, Christ has gotten up or his body has been stolen one way or the other. And either way, the person, Jesus or otherwise, thought to kind of take the burial garments and fold them up and put them in the corner. So he's out there naked somewhere, and the burial garments themselves are not like, the suit that I might be buried in if I were to die today, God forbid, but they're sort of throughout the ancient world, this kind of casual pseudo mummification thing, right? Where, after a body, after a person is deceased, the body is dressed with salt and precious oils, and then they're wrapped kind of in a linen or a sheet of some kind. So this thing is draped around him, sort of to imply, okay, this is the burial garment kind of falling off right? But he also has to be a gardener, so he has to have gotten a hat from somewhere. So we're trying to kind of connect these two realities at the same time. And then we're also showing kind of how physical and beautified he is in his resurrected state. So we're killing a lot of birds with a single stone here, just symbolically, with this little floofy, sheet that's kind of barely there. Ooh, might fall off at any moment.
That's right.
Ooh.
And it actually provokes, this is a general thing about artistic seeing, like techniques of artistic vision, that personally I'm very much attached to, which is that not always, but with some frequency, it can be very helpful when looking at an image to be open to the possibility that you are looking at a kind of double image, to be open to the possibility that parts of the image want to be, so to speak, blocked out and then put back in. That you want to be kind of looking at this in sort of stages, but the point is that they physically overlap in the same space, and so you have to be. The artist when this is done the very best, the artist achieves this extraordinary effect where you look at you end up getting both images with the thing blocked out and with the thing put in, and then you separately, so to speak, mentally, and then you get them overlapped on each other, and that's the point. So probably the best example I can think of is Caravaggio's one of Caravaggio's Rest on the Flight into Egypt. He has two of them, but one of them is phenomenal, one of them is only okay. And so he
I think we talked about this one. I think we talked about this one in the in our episode on fatherhood.
Oh,
actually,
I think we did. Yeah, I think we did.
A year ago today-ish, actually, that we talked about this one.
Hot. That's cool. Yeah, straight up. Anyway, but I think this image is also doing that kind of thing. Is that you are over like this. There's a visual impossibility happening, and when you see that again, like it's a weirdness that you have to press on, and you press on it, and you realize that multiple things are being represented at once, and that actually want to be kind of like blocked out and separated from each other conceptually and visually, and then sort of reattached and all seen as a whole. Which is a beautiful artistic, and I say this like this isn't a thing you find in every kind of image, but just like if this is a trick, gentle listener, that you have never felt yourself available to see in a work of art, I just propose to you this is something like an invitation to like be available to see that in a work of art, because when it's there, it's extremely powerful.
And I'm sorry, I know you said so already, but where is the church, or what is the church where this appears?
So it's the monastic community church of this Cistercian monastery. So it's called Heiligenkreuz in der Wiener Wald. So it's outside of Vienna.
Okay.
Yeah, and they do a tour. So if you ever find yourself in and around Vienna, it's really worth a visit. It's astonishing.
So the reason I ask is because, after I learned about this initial image, I found, many examples of it that I love. The one you're referring to here at the Cistercian Monastery is the only bas relief that I know of, but there might be others. This might be represented in sculpture somehow. I've not seen any others. There are a few. There's a really beautiful one in the Chapel of the Crucifixion in Padua, in Italy. There's this really kind of gorgeous, again, kind of swarthy, robe, but it's like this bright crimson robe. Jesus holding the shovel, big floppy hat. There's some other Italian ones that I really like. But most of them do seem to be like German, Belgian, like that kind of general area. Specifically, a lot of the ones that I really love end up being engravings. I freaking love German engravings. It tends to be that kind of all my favorite art history ends up being represented, especially religious art, ends up being a German engraving at some point, or at least a motif that's popular in German engravings.
Totally believable.
There was one I found. I'm trying to pull up the tab right now while I'm talking to you. There was one I found that's so sick because it's actually for sale, which is insane.
Hot.
Okay, yes, for a keen $5,000, if you have it to spend, you can buy a 2-column Roman Bible wrapped in Moroccan leather from 1660, printed by John Field and John Ogilby, with these absolutely stunning engravings by an artist who I think is from Amsterdam called Nicholas Vischer. And truly, I mean, for 1660, like really cinematic poses. The Last Supper image in this Bible is not a straight on image at all. It is like sort of 3/4 turn. You're seeing it from the corner. You're seeing from the perspective of one of the waiters at the supper,
cool.
kind of
Nice.
an over the shoulder shot. And it's very deeply lit. The betrayal of Jesus by Judas in the garden is also similar, where Jesus is actually the source of light in this dark garden. So everybody is illuminated by him going outward. It's really provocative, incredible art. And as an engraving, it's just black and white, right? So he's getting a lot across in just simple lines, but he has an absolutely gorgeous example of this motif. Jesus is not actually wearing the hat in this one, which I find interesting.
No, he's not always wearing a hat. I tend to like the ones where he's wearing a hat the best, but not always.
I prefer those as well, but he's almost nude. He's sort of doing the toga thing. Very visible wounds, and has sort of the shovel kind of laissez-faire over his shoulder, like very kind of casual and saucy with the shovel over his shoulder, and standing in this really elaborately rendered garden. What's fun about the garden is he's giving it to us almost like if you watch old Disney films, how they were shot on a multi-plane camera. So you'd have like 3 or 4 planes of field planes of vision that they would slide apart to give you a sense of depth and perspective. He's sort of done that here. So on the foremost plane, Jesus and Mary Magdalene viewing each other on either side of the frame. Behind them, we see kind of the outskirts of this garden, the rich fruit trees and everything. And you see a fence, and the gate of the fence is opened at a certain angle to allow us into the rest of the garden, which is in 1600 style, this very elaborate pleasure garden with hedge mazes and stuff behind it.
Love it.
So it's a really gorgeous kind of image. And what I like about the garden imagery with this one is that Jesus is very much in the wild part of the garden, like the kind of untamed woodland part of the garden. And because of the way the characters are positioned, he's almost inviting her through this just opened gate into the beautified and kind of tamed part of the garden behind them. So there's a lot of illusions happening there with wildness and beauty and cultivating as gardener, which we'll get into. So yeah, that's a gorgeous image. And in general, like I kind of want $5,000 so I can buy myself this Bible, because all of the images are just really shockingly cinematic for the period. But I'm curious what your thoughts are. I mean, as I said, a lot of my favorite artistic motifs end up being pretty heavily represented in German engravings and stuff. There's a crucifixion image that we won't talk about today, but I'd love to do a whole episode on that. And you probably know what I'm referencing, that appears in a lot of German engravings and stuff. Why do you think this image, although there are a few Italian examples, is so popular with these German artists, these Dutch artists, these Belgian artists? Do you think no idea. Says something about the faith of the people at that time, or like, what do you know about that?
No, that's a funny connection. It's a funny thought. I hadn't actually made that connection, because one of the first ones that I I mean, because of the first one that I ever saw was in Italy, and then sort of the second one that I got to know a lot about was Fra Angelico has one, which is so splendid one would just talk about it alone. But that's a different kind of image where Christ visually being the gardener is most significantly cued by the fact that he has a hoe, not a shovel this time, but a hoe over his shoulder.
Yeah, a lot of the Italian ones do swap it out for a hoe. That was one thing I didn't notice. All the German ones have shovels. All the Italian ones have like big hoes or almost like a scythe kind of thing.
Yeah, and he can have scythes too. So certainly the ones that I found that kind of caught my attention the most, with the exception of this Fra Angelico one and the one in the Minerva, did tend to come from, so like a couple of German ones. Dutch Rembrandt has one that's really phenomenal. Stuff like this. I don't know. I would have to do a deeper study to see if that's just like, so to speak, selection bias, or if it's more broadly represented. But you do get this, of course, in art history that some cultures and groups will really latch onto a sub motif for a while, and they'll just really jam with it. And then and that's it. And it's just always more popular in one place than it is in other places. I mean, like the, Baroque Spain is not the only place in history to have, realistically, plastically modeled Christ's, especially corpses on the cross, and then like Ecce Homo type images where he's, like blood drenched. It's not the only place on the planet where that's found, but it's distinctively Spanish at the same time. It's distinctively Spanish. It's distinctively Baroque and Counter-Reformation. When people in the Philippines get a hold of it, they love it so hard they can't let it go. Just like once the Spanish got it, they loved it so hard they could never let it go. So you can say, like, what can you say? I mean, this is
violence sells, baby.
Yeah, I mean, this is something very beautiful about the particularity of culture. You can say like, well, but they're relatively speaking close to each other. So like, why wouldn't this be everywhere? It's like, well, that's not how people work. This caught their attention and they really liked it, and it didn't catch other people's attention in the same way. So there you go.
It does seem though, like with a lot of religious art out of the late 1600s into the mid 1700s, particularly out of Germany, Belgium, Amsterdam, there does tend to be a focus on the naked masculinity of Christ in a very particular way. Because a lot of my favorite images of this same motif in Italy or elsewhere, he is much more clothed. But even in crucifixion images and different things, during this period in German art, particularly in the engravings, you see a much greater focus in general during this period on musculature, right? Everybody is simultaneously a little chunky and also jacked.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's perfect
kind of
combo.
Universally. But in, that's my body type.
That's right.
But in
chunky, but
specifically,
jacked. Yeah, but jacked.
Right. Yeah, everybody's dad bod it out the wazoo. But yeah, it does seem like specifically for this, 100 to 150 years in art coming out of Germany, real focus on like the masculine body of Christ. A lot of nude crucifixes, lot of emphasis on his masculine genitalia, a lot of emphasis on kind of the masculine form and revealing it and trying to kind of do theological study or exegesis on it. I don't know. I want to learn more about why that is, but it seems too unilateral and consistent across various art motifs to ignore.
Could be. That's a big deal in Renaissance and post-Renaissance Italian art as well. That sort of cluster of motifs, and you're going to have a very strong initial influence from ultimately from the discovery of the Belvedere Apollo. There's as soon as they discover the Belvedere Apollo, basically people start representing Christ to look like Apollo, specifically the Belvedere Apollo. So this is how you get Michelangelo specifically is doing this and everything. And then it becomes sort of representative, and there's a theology of Christ as an ideal type, as an ideal physical man, and all these kinds of things. So I think there's a big cluster of things going in here that I think is there's so many different threads going in and coming in from different time periods and different places that I think it's going to be hard to generalize broadly about it, just because I think it's probably a lot of different themes in a lot of different times and places. But I think it's really worth calling attention to regardless, just to say, like, did you know there's this thing? And it's really worth paying attention to, you know?
Yeah. And I want to dig, no pun intended, with our whole gardening themed episode here. I do want to dig more into kind of the masculine imagery there and why it's not just funny and overly literal to depict Christ as the gardener in the garden this way. Because I think it's important artistically. I think it's important personally and theologically. But I'm worried if I jump right into that, I'm not going to get to like two other images that I really want to show. So I'm going to just artificially deviate, if you don't mind, to talk about those. We've been kind of firmly in like 16 to 1750 ish here for most of the art we've been talking about, but I want to rewind to the like around 1530 or so. There end up being a lot of images in Italy around this time where Christ is, or it's the flip side of the images I was just talking about. So in the image I was just talking about, in the German engraving from that Bible that I mentioned, he is almost fully nude, has the shovel kind of draped lazily over his shoulder, doesn't have the hat. 100 years before in Italy, around 1530, you're seeing a lot of images where it's kind of the reverse. They're really emphasizing the gardener thing, de-emphasizing the masculine nudity, right? So there's a specific image that I love by, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, Girolamo de Santa Croce, I think is how I pronounce it.
Yeah.
It's what's the matter go? And it's literally just titled Christ as Gardener. And I believe it's currently on display at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but I could be wrong. In this, he is fully clothed. He's wearing kind of a gardener's outer tunic, brown outer tunic, kind of on top of the white undergarment. He does have the floppy hat, although it looks a little bit more like a World War I helmet,
yes,
which is
awesome.
More kind of conducive to what a gardener would have been, like that kind of shape of Italian hat at that time. He does have the hoe as well. What I love about this one, because I'm me and it's Easter, is this, and I know I'm deviating us so freaking hard, but I would genuinely not be true to my authentic personality if I did not bring this up. This image also, sidebar, has another motif in it where we get another great Easter tradition, the Easter bunny.
Hell yeah.
From
Bring on
this
the bunny.
image. So if you look at this, so Jesus is on our right-hand side. He's gesturing to Mary Magdalene, who's this very traditional sort of Medici-styled Italian woman, golden hair, scarlet robe, golden shawl thingy. She has the little bottle of oil that she was bringing to the tomb to adorn the body with. Behind her are two rabbits mirroring their postures.
Love it.
A white rabbit and a brown rabbit playing with each other. And the white rabbit in the kind of mid 1500s, especially around 1530-ish in Italy, is most likely, that motif of the white rabbit in religious art is most likely actually where we get the Easter bunny. There's a lot of like sort of retroactive, it definitely comes from this like pagan tradition and the goddess Ostara in Germany, but there's almost no evidence to say that the Germanic peoples ever even believed in a goddess called Ostara. That comes from like one line that Jacob Grimm the actual Grimm's brothers wrote down in a book, and it cannot be substantiated anywhere. So that whole sort of, there's a pagan origin to the term Easter and Easter bunny and all that stuff.
No, that's all nonsense. Yeah.
Fortunately for some, unfortunately for others, like largely retconned and totally apocryphal. Where the Easter bunny comes from, if it comes from anywhere at all, is more likely this tradition that really hit the zeitgeist in Italy around 1530, where whenever they wanted to show kind of a Marian influence, they would include this white rabbit, because rabbits have this ability to conceive a second time while already pregnant. And so there was this understanding that maybe rabbits were essentially having kids without having sex first, right? That they were producing children immaculately. And so specifically making the rabbit white leans into that purity, and the white rabbit becomes like a predominant symbol of Mary, to the degree that around the same time as the Santa Croce paints this image of Christ as gardener that I'm talking about, Titian comes in with his Madonna of the Rabbit, where it's literally a painting of Mary giving the baby Jesus to, I believe St. Catherine. I think it's St. Catherine. I can't remember.
Probably. Could well be.
And Catherine of Alexandria. Yeah, that's what it is. And she's showing baby Jesus. Yeah, St. Catherine of Alexandria. And she's showing baby Jesus, this little white rabbit, like literally holding it kind of out to him so that he can pet it in a very adorable kind of like Pat the Bunny type way.
I love this.
And that was also painted in 1530. So like there's this real moment of Easter bunnies happening in the gardens of all these images at the same time as this Christ as gardener thing in the resurrection is happening. So yeah, a lot of like Easter pop, Easter symbolism, Easter kitsch stuff, having its kind of origins, its germination at this point, which I love.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's so hot. I did come to think of now that I'm seeing it, I have seen that Madonna of the Rabbit before, but I have not. I don't know how you see this image and you don't attend to the bunny, but I'm gonna be honest, I did not attend.
Especially
to
since the
bunny.
Title is Madonna of the Rabbit.
You know what? Things have titles, but titles are all made up. They're all added after the fact. But
it's a beautiful image because his wife had just died.
Oh wow, yeah.
And Titian's wife had just died, and I know a lot about it because it's like one of my favorite images because of the Easter Bunny thing. And his wife had just died, and in his grief, basically the family had strongly encouraged / forced him to give the daughter that his wife had died in childbirth having to his sister. They were like, you can't take care of this kid.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And so his sister was raising his daughter, and he was working on this painting during that period.
Oh my gosh.
Like during the year-long period where he was kind of in cloister in mourning his wife and his daughter. And so Jesus, the baby Jesus, is being handed to St. Catherine of Alexandria in a mirror pose of the way he's having to give his daughter up.
Right.
And you can actually see him, he painted himself in the background as a homeless kind of shit covered shepherd watching this whole thing mournfully. So there's this idea of like Mary giving up her son. I'm giving up my daughter, but here is this rabbit that she points back to that is hope and purity and all these things. It's really like it opens as kind of a schmaltzy cutesy image, and then there's so much pathos and grief happening.
Yeah.
I find it very provocative.
Yeah. That doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, Titian's one of the greatest painters in the universe, and so this doesn't surprise me at all because that's just how he rolls. But no, it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Yeah.
But we should get back to digging into the garden motif here specifically.
Yeah, there's something I
want to give that.
Yeah,
I want to toss that over to you.
Right. So there's something I want to talk about with that, which is that I was thinking about this, like, other than just that I love these images and that it's really fun and that there's once you kind of recognize it as a visual genre, then like you just like there's all these mini motifs that work out within it, and then you see the way that it plays into other things, and it's all really, really cool, you know. But I was thinking like, well, okay, I like it, and I've had a lot of fruitful personal reflection and spiritual reflection on it at various times, but like, why? You know, like what's going on here? And I was trying to like put a little bit more like better words on that for myself. And like at one level, you can say there's this like very strong kind of farce element about the thing, which is like, he's wearing like a mask with a, you know, he's wearing like a fake mustache, and it's like, it's me, you know.
So the hat's covering his eyes. Yeah, there's like the opening of the anime Cowboy Bebop sort of has that, where he like has the hat down over his face, right?
Oh yeah,
and then it's like, and they're like, oh, who's that guy? And he lifts it up. It's like, I'm that guy.
It's like, oh, it's you. Like, oh, I didn't recognize you under your hat. You know, so there's a kind of farce element to it, which is, you know, there's that. Yeah. So, you know, so there's that, but that is just, it's just too rich of an image, and it's too broadly found for just to be a farce thing. I mean, for one thing, it just doesn't fit like the actual locations of these images. They're usually in places like, these are religious images. I mean, they're often in sacred spaces, for like often monastic contemplation and things.
So in Bibles, and even the way they're adjusted is like, as I said, even the black and white ones the lighting is incredibly tender, and there's sort of the blocking is very intimate. You know, there's it opens with this sort of farcical thing, almost like when you're drinking a cocktail and like you drink it and like the first flavor that hits you is like just the fruit juice that's in the cocktail. But then there's all this subtlety and nuance that immediately flows in after that if you take more than a second.
Yeah, right. It's like, it's this kind of thing where like, okay, well, I guess I just have to like sit with this for a little bit longer, you know? And one of the things I think that comes out in sitting with it a little bit longer is, so I would say, rather than thinking about it as kind of like a gotcha game, like, like, oh, look, it's me beneath this mustache or this hat or whatever. It's actually much more Shakespearean. So, you know, Shakespeare, like a number of Shakespeare's plays have this, sometimes can seem incredible, like it stretches credulity beyond where it's easy to give, you know,
right,
where, you know, generally it'll be, I mean, it's the lots of different things, but say for instance, you have a husband who's suspicious of his wife or something like that his wife's cheating on him, or like a friend who's suspicious of his best friend that maybe he's cheating on his wife with him or whatever, you know, it's something like this. And somehow they'll end up mysteriously in this scene where like one of them, usually the suspicious one, will have like the teensiest little opera mask on, you know, like 2 square inches of their face is covered. And now like his own wife can't recognize him. And like they have like long conversations, but she can't recognize his voice and can't recognize him because he has like 2 square inches of silk around his eyes, or these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Or
like a very similar thing happens in Merchant of Venice, right? Where she's like testing all the guys, but she's in a disguise.
Right.
And, you know, all those kinds of things. Yeah.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Where it's like the teeniest, tiniest kind of disguise, but suddenly it changes everything about the person and nobody can recognize them and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so the conceit there, as far as I know, always when it plays out in one of Shakespeare's plays. Now, I would be happy to be corrected on that. People who are better read in his oeuvre than I am, but what is at play there is that the mask is never supposed to hide. The mask is meant to unveil. That the mask unveils the state of the heart of the person who's wearing it. Usually the person who's wearing it. But regardless, the mask unveils. The mask exposes what is secret in the heart. And so, you know, either exposing, so it's exposing the separation of the hearts of the two people at play, in whatever direction that's working, whoever is, so to speak, the victim, whoever is, so to speak, the aggressor. That's the whole point of the mask. And so it's not that he's asking you to stretch your credulity beyond what it can be believed. It's that he's using this physical object and its performance to physically manifest the interior state of the heart, and where the person is vis-a-vis, say, his wife. That when she sees him manifesting his mistrust, which is what it is, he's wearing a mask because he doesn't trust her, she literally doesn't recognize him. And he can talk to her for as long as he wants, and she's not going to recognize him, because this is the thing that's hidden in him that he has unveiled in such a fashion as to prevent her from being able to recognize it.
I was going to joke, because I already referenced it in my reference to denouement when I was talking about the Passion of the Christ. I have the movie, the Jim Carrey movie, The Mask, on my brain. And so I was going to joke when you were saying that is the point of the mask, to reveal what is in. But actually, that is the point of that movie. That is the point of the mask. The mask does actually reveal his interior.
That's actually kind of what masks do. In fact, that's kind of why they exist.
Yeah, so actually, that's not so much of a joke. That's just actually what the mask is about.
Did you know there's this movie from the 1990s, Jim Carrey, that was really, if you were 12 when you first watched it, you would still think it's the best movie in the world, which I'm not sure who in this room does.
If you're any older, it's garbage. Yeah.
How dare you? That is the best movie in the world. And now that is one thing that's happening here. That's one thing that's happening here, is that there's a lot to say. This is an astonishingly rich textual scene from the Gospel of John, and you could spend as long as you wanted and longer pulling things out of this, or discovering that in a way infinitely more astonishing than Mary Poppins' bag, that there's always more here to be brought out, but one of the things that's happening here is, you say, like, how is it possible, how is it possible that she doesn't recognize him? How is it possible that she thinks he's the gardener and all of this? Like, well, this is a mask, right? It's a disguise, it's a mask, it's whatever you want to say. And the Heiligenkreuz one kind of really, really emphasizes this, that it's he's just got these literally like two accessories. Like, he's essentially naked with two accessories, and you're like, kind sir, that does not make you less naked when you're holding a shovel.
It's my favorite way to be.
Yeah, exactly. Just naked but accessorized. It's to expose what's there, right? So there is at least one level of things that's happening in the biblical encounter, is that Mary Magdalene, who is so faithful to Christ, even she, whose heart has been so shaped by love for him, is so firm about what she thinks she's seeing that there is that it exposes a distance that nobody who has been attentively reading the Gospels would have thought was there. You would think like, oh yeah, she's already like, she's right there, like with Mary and all that, Mary, the mother of Jesus. But no, like, it exposes, and this is not a criticism, it's just that it actually exposes a deeper horizon of intimacy and love that we didn't realize was there. And so it's this disguise, this mask that unveils the actual character of the resurrection, and the way that the resurrected body, as a resurrected body, Christ's resurrected body, proposes a horizon of intimacy with Jesus Christ that is infinitely more expansive and intimate and even physical than we could have ever imagined.
Well, and it's that interior reality that's being revealed through his mask of the gardener's accoutrement that points to a theological motif that I cannot possibly speak to non-reductionistically, because so many lengthy books and treatises and even podcasts have been done on it already. But there is this motif that you could probably speak to a little more academically than I can, where Christ is viewed as the new Adam, right? That Adam and Eve are in this garden. They share perfect intimacy with one another and with God. And then by opening themselves up to distrusting God and taking knowledge of good and evil for themselves, they allow evil and death into the world. And the very first thing that happens when they allow death into the world is that intimacy is separated. They hide their nakedness from God, and they hide their nakedness from one another. And that's not meant to be like a sexual thing, like, ooh, Adam and Eve committed some sexual sin and now God's mad at them. It's no. By allowing death and evil and distrust into the world, this thing that was meant for intimacy is now seen as a source of insecurity, right? As seen as a way that I could be hurt and I need to hide that thing. And that's just one of the motifs that's being added, or being spoken to. But when we talk about Christ's new Adam, but specifically when he's appearing then as the gardener after the resurrection, there's this idea that he has now reversed that whole, he's uno reverse carded that whole thing, where he is saying, hey, I have now conquered death. And by conquering death, I have now invited intimacy, that kind of radical intimacy, back into the relationship between God and man and his fellow man. And so that image of him and Mary Magdalene specifically is reverse mirroring, right? Eve giving Adam that apple, allowing, symbolically, not literally giving him an apple, but symbolically kind of bringing evil into the world that way. Now Christ is, in some of these images, actually, as I already said, pointing to this open gate to a beautified garden. He's in his nude state, showing that radical intimacy that he longs to have with us, that an intimacy so radical that it justified all the bullshit and suffering he's just put himself through. But he's also wearing the gardener hat to show, hey, we are in the garden again. This is not just, I'm just not naked for the hell of it. This is, we are in the Garden of Eden again, where that intimacy can happen.
Right, exactly.
Between God and man.
Yeah, and as God and man. That's the thing, because of course, like, God is in a dramatic way represented sort of as a gardener in Genesis 2 and 1, 2, and 3, but especially 2 and 3. It just says, like Genesis 2:8, the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed, and out of the ground the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight, and it goes on,
Which is sick, by the way, because there's so much. I mean, you talk about at the beginning of this episode, the sort of trying to render the unrenderable or show the unshowable with the resurrection, but like most of the images of God kind of creating the world are always, he's, a wizard kind of waving his hand over an abyss, and then the earth is just sort of appearing. But the Bible is very clear that like, that's not what it wants. That's not the symbolism. That's not the visual picture that it's trying to paint.
Well, right? that's kind of the visual image that you can get with Genesis 1, but Genesis 2 is very
sure. Genesis 1, but Genesis 2 is very clearly like he's going and physically planting a garden. There's a radical physicality to this.
Yeah, and then like in Genesis 3, he's Adam will stroll with God in the garden in the cool of the evening, So this is a strong sense of like the master of the garden, who's where, God is the master of the garden, who takes his constitutional in the evening, and it's all lovely. So there's this, right? So he's actually God. So it's God who is the gardener of the Garden of Eden. But then also he entrusts that to Adam. And then like the first, Eve has her things, but like the words that God says to Adam are like, hey, that whole gardening thing? Like, you remember how that was awesome? And Adam's like, yeah, gardening, I love it. It's so great. Just put on my headphones and just have my tunes, He's like, well, guess what's going to suck now? And Adam's like, oh no, not gardening. God's like, yeah, gardening sucks now. And he's like, oh no, because that's what he said. The ground will put out thorns and thistles, and you'll live by the labor of your brow, and you'll be by the sweat of your brow. So like God makes this God is the gardener who gives Adam the ability to garden, and it has this perfection to it that shares in God's joy in in the garden of the human heart, in the garden of the world that he's made for the human heart to be a place where he loves God. And then blah, forget all that. Didn't need that. Let's just do something that sucks instead. And then exactly like you get Christ as the new gardener, as the new Adam, who is then, but who's also God. And so he's the new gardener in both senses, because now he is the man, a human being, right? The man who has plowed. This is a really beautiful image from Cashin, one of the desert guy who reports on the Desert Fathers in the beginning of the 5th century. He has this astonishing image where he says that we have to plow the heart with the cross. That the cross is a furrow, right? The cross is the cross is a plow that draws furrows in the heart where the word can be planted, right? So the cross, so Christ has used the cross as a plow to actually tear a furrow into the rough and resistant ground of the neglected garden that is like the human heart, and that is the world that we've made out of it. And that's as man and as God, of course, he does it, but simultaneously. But we can emphasize that, because he dies, as human, he dies, right? Like this is a human, only humans can die. Like this is a human thing, that he's and as God, he is resurrected, which is specifically a God thing. Like a human being can't do that. And he's in the garden now as both, as God who creates the garden in the first place, and as man who has been slain also in a garden or outside of a garden, and been buried in a garden, and is now made new, or is now better than that. It's risen from the dead, and so you get the new gardener image in both of his natures, which is, of course, I mean, we know, right? Like this is what's happening in the resurrection. Like this is why it's a big deal, because it's strictly divine. It's not something that can happen to a human body, but it happens to his human body, because it turns out that like he's actually a divine person with a real human nature and a real divine nature and all this. Like it's all like, then you get into like the really beautiful deep waters of Christian theology, but all of this is wrapped up in looking at the sometimes kind of goofy images of Christ with his like gardener accoutrement.
Well, and here's why this is important to me psychologically and artistically, and even from like a kind of a gender place, right? Because we're throwing around this word, as man, right? Christ as man, and we're meaning that as humanity, but specifically also it says something really important about masculinity, right? So as a psychotherapist, I talk with a lot of people, especially Christians, who have been hurt or wounded in some way by what we might commonly refer to as like a toxic form of masculinity, right? Toxic masculinity, where, it's very, associated with aggression and shutting down your feelings and kind of all the things that are antithetical to the radical intimacy that's expressed in these images of the resurrected Christ, right? Not to put too fine a point on it. And unfortunately, a lot of the leaders in what would be considered kind of a toxic masculinity come out of Christianity, right? There are a lot of Christian speakers, both Catholic and non, Catholic and Protestant alike, who have really pushed this idea of men are men and women are women and blah, 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 blah. But what they mean by that is like men are aggressive assholes who don't have feelings, and women are, the emotional ones who stay at home. And they claim to be able to support this with scripture and tradition, but never actually, cite anything and can't really. And when you ask any of those kinds of guys, many of whom I've counseled, some of whom I've tried to maintain friendships with, however flawedly, when you ask those guys to kind of distill what it is they think manhood is, they always define it by action, which is, man is the protector, right? Man is he protects his wife, he protects his child, he's the protector. And they do this almost in a colonialist way where like they resent how kind of feminine and feelingsy they see the church as having become, the church kind of broadly speaking Christianity, right? And so, they want to reintroduce masculinity, hoorah, into Christianity with this model of man as protector. But I think the reason why they don't see that kind of masculinity reflected in Christianity isn't because the church has, as they often say, become feminized. It's because that idea of masculinity cannot exist in the resurrection, because freed from evil, freed from sin, and returned to the radical intimacy that Christ wants for us and embodies in these, at first, silly, goofy images that we're talking about, we don't need to be protected from shit. We don't need protection from anything anymore.
Fair, yeah.
And so their entire model of masculinity is one that is inherently connected to sin and must necessarily pass away, right? And therefore, it is not a model of masculinity that Christ embodies or wants us to embody. What Christ wants us to embody is the role of the gardener. Sometimes that is going to require protection, but that's not the identity. Sometimes the gardener has to protect his garden from, I don't know, Easter rabbits who want to come in and eat the carrots or whatever. God. But like, that is not what the gardener is going to put on his business card, right? That is a necessary evil that sometimes the gardener has to do. The gardener's identity, his vocation, if you will, is as the person who comes in and gets the soil on his hands and gets up close and intimate with the life and cultivates it. I mean, not even in just a theological way, but like in an anthropological way. The word husband literally comes from the Norse. I don't know how to pronounce it. I think it's hausbundai, I think is how you would pronounce it. But it's literally to till the soil, right? The verb is to till the soil, makes you a husband, right? To cultivate, to grow, to nurture is to be a man. Right? And Christ is presenting this radical, non-toxic vision of masculinity that is defined by the craft, that is defined by the tenderness, that is defined by the closeness to the thing that he's working with, that I think is fundamental to understanding our identity as men, fundamental to understanding our identity as Christians, and per the nature of this podcast, fundamental to understanding the nature of being an artist. Right? Because again, whether you have soil on your hands and you're talking about that kind of patience and love and closest intimacy, or whether you're talking about the same kind of patience and love and intimacy of having, paint on your hands or sawdust on your hands or chalk on your hands from the dance and the boundless beam and everything else, it's the same tenderness and intimacy and commitment to making things new through that kind of radical intimacy that only Christ can fully embody, as he does again in these seemingly goofy images. I know that's my little homily, but I just think it's really freaking important to understanding properly all the stuff we care about: Christianity, mysticism, spirituality, being an artist, being a person. Like it's like Prego pasta sauce, right? It's all in there. It's all in this goofy image of a naked guy wearing a hat and a shovel draped over his shoulder. It's all there.
Yeah. And it is a big deal. I mean, you're right. The temptation to define what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman by function or by a pattern of functions or whatever is a really tough one because if we believe that the way that our bodies are made, male and female, he created them as Genesis says, right? Like, then like there has to be an eternal importance to being male and being female. And like, one of the things that the resurrected body shows us, even just from the fact that Mary doesn't recognize him and it's weird, and this things about the scene that seem to be impossible, and there's all this, is again like that Christ's resurrected body is exposing a horizon here of bodily being that is beyond what we can. It's clearly bodily being. It's clear of some kind. He can be recognized as the same man when it's important for that to happen. He
demonstrably eats. I mean, the first thing he says
that's important.
Like,
all these things. Yeah, he's
right?
Like, all right, give me some. Yeah, all right, eat some fish. Yeah, got some fish. Fine, I'll eat some fish. Cool, great. Yeah, all right.
Hyper physical.
And here he is. You know, that there's that, as you say, like there is something. We're presented with an eternal perfection of human masculinity perfected first. I mean, obviously critically, there's a sense in which is humanity perfected that we are seeing. So right. So I'm not saying women are excluded from this. Obviously not. This is also part of why it's so important that Catholics believe in the assumption of the Virgin Mary, that we see actually a specific concrete human femininity, human body, also in heaven already, you know, just because it's so easy for people to forget, you know, and in some way sort of overemphasize the masculinity or whatever, but just say like, no, it's that important that God took his mother bodily into heaven as soon as she died, so that nobody would ever have any justification for thinking that like men had more place in heaven than women did, you know, stuff like this. Obviously there's a lot more going on there, but that is one thing that's important, you know, because we always need to be reminded of these things. And but it's so beautiful because there's also a masculine perfection here that like is more than we can completely imagine, because you're totally right. Like if I'm just going to describe this in functionalist terms, like, well, goodbye to all those functions. So, okay, you know, okay.
Right. Well, and you talk about the women thing, but like, I mean, that's why I think this image is so incredible, right? Because so I'll draw our attention to another example. There's another Crisis Gardener image around that I really love around I think again 1660, Jacques Jourdain's, who I assume is a German artist. But in this one, Christ is in by far the floppiest hat of any of the ones we've talked about.
Pimp, nice.
Wearing kind of the pink, the pink drape, pink always kind of associated with earthliness in art of that period. And he's talking to all three of the women who come to the tomb in this. Mary Magdalene is on her knees kind of adoring him, but the other two women are also there like psyched. And, you know, he's pointing again to this tended garden, right? And like, with that sort of hoorah version of masculinity that we were talking about, like, you know, oh, the man is, you know, protector and the woman stays at home with the baby. It's like, well, the woman only has to stay at home if the man is going off to what? To work, to toil, which again is the thing that happens as a result of sin and evil entering the garden. Right?
Work would have been there. It's just that it wouldn't have been. He wouldn't have been. He wouldn't have been leaving by the sweat of his brow. Okay, but work would have been
exactly.
There.
But you know what I mean. Like there's this idea of I have to go out to slave away to make ends meet. Well, you stay at home to do this thing. Like both of these offices, these gendered offices, are predicated upon sin. And what does our identities as male and female look like? What do our identities as male and female look like in the resurrected state? It looks like this. It looks like this image of Jesus wearing a floppy hat in a moment of intimacy with Mary Magdalene, pointing the way to ultimately her preaching and to this wild garden that he wants us to be a part of with him. And I just think that's incredibly, incredibly cool to meditate on. And then there are Easter bunnies there too. So holy shit, you got the full package.
What more do you want, man?
I couldn't want anything else. Is there anything else you want to put a cherry on top of this thing with?
No, because if I bring up anything more, then it would be for another 2 hours. And no. I mean, this is great.
Fair enough. I think we've thoroughly tilled this soil as it is, so to speak. So, with that, go get your hands dirty in the soil. Go be radically intimate with your craft. Happy Easter. Go forth and create cool things.
This has been Created Things, a production of Art, Soul, and Mind, hosted by Jacob Flores-Popchak and Father Gabriel Toretta, produced by Kyle Meineke and Jessica Flores-Popchak. Theme song by Federico Carranza. For more on this podcast and the artists featured, follow us on Instagram at Created Things Podcast and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and wherever fine podcasts are streamed.